I don't truly know who the audience for these videos is. People of so many backgrounds and with so many different lives can all become fascinated by the global financial machine, geopolitics, and macro. Yet there's a very interesting phenomenon. Generally, the upper classes and the lower classes are quite willing to talk about wealth, or at least the mechanisms of wealth, while the middle class becomes quite uncomfortable. Yet to understand this global apparatus and how the money system works, it is very worthwhile to understand familial wealth, the role that the fortunes of families plays, and for so many of the middle and lower classes, who look on vast estates and enormous net worths, and assume that such families must have so much freedom, they must have so much agency and power. There's a lot more nuance that is very worth understanding, for so often the people who appear to be the most wealthy in the world have really become transformed into the actors of entities far more powerful. So let's explore some of the fascinating dynamics of family wealth, estates, family offices. If the upper classes are unfamiliar to you, then this should prove fascinating, and hopefully serve to explain some of the dynamics that run our modern world. And yet if you are from the upper classes, then perhaps this will be familiar, and maybe this can elucidate some of the mechanisms at play and how we got here. For what appears to be wealth isn't truly wealth. There's a layer much deeper than what people see. This is an exploration of the trust trap, the triumph of invisible financiers over the visible wealthy, of powerful financial entities in the shadows, and the subtleties that make wealth quite different than how it appears. This is the estate prison. Think yourself to be a landed nobleman centuries ago. It's the 17th century, and vast, magnificent estates are visible across the European countrysides. Some of these families are newer, perhaps a great hero of a war, someone granted land and title by the king, or perhaps this vast estate has been with a family since medieval times, tracing its history back to a knight, someone who fought alongside a great hero who won a kingdom. Regardless of how that estate got there, these families are visible, present. You know their names, you know their homes, and they cannot be separated from the land. For the physical estate is their home, and the land is who they are. Yet by the 17th century, the world was becoming more financialized. European empires were spreading across the world. Systems of debt were becoming more sophisticated. Stock exchanges were growing enormous, and business ventures had become international. The world of wealth was becoming more complex, and just as there were new ways to make wealth, there were as well new ways to lose it. So think yourself to be an elderly nobleman in England during the 17th century. Your land and title are to pass to your son upon your death. Yet you know your son. He's reckless, foolish, irresponsible. And you know that in this environment he could so easily squander the family's legacy and charge. This estate, this legacy is bigger than him. So it's not as though you're simply setting your son up with wealth. You are consigning an enormous responsibility into his care. And you don't have a choice. The laws of the estate say how it is to flow from you to your heir. So how do you protect this estate from the foolish son? Well, around this time, English common law would develop strict settlement and fee tail. In a fee simple, a landowner no longer owned the land, but instead became a permanent tenant, able to collect rents as though he owned the land. However, he could not sell it. Thus, if an irresponsible heir were to take over a noble estate, the land would still generate income and be secured for the family. But if he were to, say, get into heavy gambling debt, then there would be no legal mechanism by which he could sell off one single acre, or as well chop down certain timber, even mortgage the property without the consent of the next unborn male heir. And thus the relationship between landowner and land was fundamentally changing. Someone like an earl, a duke, or perhaps a wealthy gentleman was no longer the true owner and holder, as though the estate were his wealth. He was more like a custodian, temporarily charged with the estate, yet unable to fundamentally alter it. And so, under these new systems, a landed nobleman was a steward, a guardian. And though this isn't a direct legal parallel, metaphorically, more like the CEO of the estate, as opposed to the one who owned all the stock. This seemed successful, at least for the time being. However, all the while, a rising financial class was increasingly attempting to gain dominance over the landed upper class. Despite these novel protections, some very old noble families were still going broke, others being forced to merge with financial families. Yet this was still a fairly slow process, at least until the 19th century. During the 19th century, industrialization picked up rapidly. Where once the true souls of European nations were in the countryside, with the rural estates, the visible hearts of civic and cultural life, increasingly the industrialized cities gained dominance. Many would leave the countryside, entering into these rapidly booming cities in order to gain new employment opportunities that they could not find out in the rural fields. And so the landed estates were losing prominence. The industrialists and financiers would gain not only increasing economic power, but in turn political power as well. In much of Western Europe, land values would plummet during this century, and at the same time, those large country houses became increasingly expensive to maintain. So imagine you have a very large house with a very large staff that's been in your families for generations, yet all of a sudden the land that it's on becomes worth a whole lot less. The tenants who had been the source of economic output on your estate are all moving into the cities, and the costs just to maintain the house, let alone develop anything new, become impossible to maintain. So what do you do as your large house begins rotting away? Well, naturally, the idea that many would come to is that this land isn't nearly as productive as it used to be, so why not just sell some of the land? Yet even if you had something like a roof collapsing in, if you were under these legal frameworks, you could not sell any of the land. And so many of these families were stuck. There was nothing they could do, and no way for them to get the money. And so, the estate simply rotted from the inside out. Some were able to find solutions. In the United Kingdom, for example, the Dukes Marlborough were able to maintain their magnificent English Baroque estate, able to call itself a palace, Blenheim Palace, as well as the Grosvenors, the Marquess and Dukes Westminster, who would develop a very successful real estate portfolio, including the development of Belgravia. Yet aside for some cases, the story for many was simply you were born into a series of rules. You had to follow many social protocols, really didn't have many options for what you wanted to do in life, and just had to sit around and watch as your once great house fell apart, cracks in the roof turned to floods, and mold began to make it uninhabitable. For a great many, you were just doomed to watch your family legacy slowly rot, waiting until there was nothing left. Until, in 1882, a solution would come. A solution would come with the passage of the Settled Land Acts, the first that year, the second in 1890. This would loosen the restrictions on these estates, allowing these tenants for life to be able to sell some of the land, provided it was to be used for the upkeep of the estate. It couldn't go to anything lavish. It couldn't even really go to anything that would make the estate more productive. All you could really do was sell away everything you had, piece by piece, just to stay in place. And so the financial class was rising. Bankers were beginning to build estates that dwarfed noblemen. In fact, bankers were beginning to get noble titles of their own. And those who had held land for generations really were now in a situation where they were doomed to lose their estate, but they were doomed to do so in the slowest way possible. Yet, it wasn't really the landowner who was doing this. To further compound just how much of a shift in class dynamics was underway, the profits from these land sales did not become the landowners. They went to a board of independent trustees who invested it on the landowner's behalf. So really someone who from the outside appeared to be a very wealthy nobleman with a great title and a magnificent estate, a beautiful and opulent country home, had really become a guy who sat around and had to play the role of what a nobleman used to be, and what people imagined a nobleman was, while a group of lawyers and financiers acting as trustees slowly sold off the estate just to keep up the appearance that it was still beautiful and magnificent. And so these estates really weren't the families anymore. The families had become people who got to live there, but increasingly you wouldn't really even want to live in those homes. The sale of the lands did allow for some upkeep, but by and large conditions were getting pretty bad. They were extremely cold, the elements were getting in, even though the land sales would allow for something like a roof to be fixed. These really weren't nice homes. They were set pieces, slowly dwindling away, and under the control of trustees. So certainly the family legacy element remained. So many in this traditional class wanted to maintain their responsibilities, to uphold the institution and traditions. But as they had become so estranged, many stopped really caring all that much, because these really weren't their homes anymore. It was more like a historical site that they had to show up as the mascot for, while the trustees and financiers slowly chipped away at it to make it look good for the public. All the same, this wasn't everyone. There were still some families who were able to hold on. Some who had just enough liquidity had successfully begun business or financial ventures, like the Grosvenor example earlier. Some would transition into being part of these financial empires. Some built factories, some started banks, and so for many they had found a way to survive. Yet their wealth did not come from their ancestral estate. The estate was still really more of a set piece at that point. For many of these families, their wealth was indistinguishable from the wealthy financial commercial middle class. As well, in order to survive, a great many of them began marrying with the commercial and financial wealthy. It would become extremely common for some decaying European noble family to marry with someone like the daughter of an American industrialist, Consuelo Vanderbilt, born to the American Vanderbilt Railroad family, would marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo's mother Alva viewed this as a means to secure incredible social status, as the Dukes of Marlborough were about as at the top of the British nobility as one could be, while in the marriage, the Duke received around $2.5 million in railroad stock. Without this marriage, the Spencer Churchill family would no longer own Blenheim, and so this posed one possible avenue to preserve familial wealth and keep the estates alive. Another marriage in the same family would be Jenny Jerome and Lord Randolph Churchill. She would come with a £50,000 dowry and a constant supply of wealth from Leonard Jerome, who at the time was a very powerful New York investor, allowing Lord Randolph to maintain his political aspirations and ultimately resulting in the birth of their son Winston Churchill. Daughter of real estate fortune, Mary Leiter, would marry the Marquis Curzon of Kettleston. Frances Ellen Work, from Franklin Works' dry goods fortune, would marry the Baron Fermoy, and so the list goes on. By this point in the latter 19th or early 20th century, you were either functionally destitute, had jumped ship and joined the ranks of the banker, industrialist, financial class, or had found yourself a dollar Duchess sugar mommy. Yet even after everything that had happened, these mechanisms did allow some families to make it through, and even those who weren't in very good shape still had title and social prestige. They were largely actors, but still, for a great many, they were surviving. Until the First World War. The First World War would be particularly devastating to the upper classes of all the West, yet particularly to Britain's nobility. In the post-war United States, and particularly after Vietnam, we've become very used to wealthy families finding every weaselly way possible to get their sons out of going to war, to the point where the line, "I ain't no senator's son," just makes sense. The First World War was not like that at all. These traditional noble families had a very different ethos than much of the newer wealth. Because they were so tied to the land, Their families had such deep history in the nation, and they had such a responsibility of being so visible and being looked up to, even as so many had lost almost all of their power, and were watching their estates rot away. This sense that they were a warrior elite, the original origin of Britain's landed aristocracy, was still something they felt a lot of pride and duty in, something that, for them, felt like the reason that they were in this position, that their title meant being a warrior. And so the sons of these families disproportionately made up the ranks of the junior officer class, and in turn, particularly as so many of them had been raised on stories of their ancestors and great glorious battles, they would die at a vastly disproportionate rate. After the First and Second World Wars, so many of these families simply ended. The line simply stopped. Yet beyond that, for those who did make it, particularly prompted by financial advisors from the City of London banking class, like the Prime Minister's advisor in the First World War, Nathan Rothschild, a staggering estate tax was implemented, at one point reaching as high as 80% for British estates. And for many, it was entirely impossible. There was absolutely no way to pay an 80% estate tax. If you were a landed nobleman and had to pass on your estate, dying over the course of the war years, that estate was not getting to your heir. It was going to the British state. And so they really seemed to be in a corner. What would you do? Can you really think of a way out? Well, a few avenues were explored, but really there was only one that became the solution. Some did simply forfeit their estates, perhaps became respectable politicians or businessmen, yet ultimately allowed their families to fade into obscurity. Yet for many, particularly advised by these trustees, the solution was to hand over the estate to a charitable trust. A great many of these old estates would end up in the possession of the National Trust, while others used similar methods, placing them into fairly complex entities. And this handing over had much wider-reaching implications. This wasn't like you just owned a cool historic castle and you were giving it over to a historic society. You were effectively signing over your family. If you wanted to continue to live in your ancestral home, you no longer had a say over who came in. You no longer had a say over what happened to it. Your home was open to the public, and you had no control. And so for a great many, this was more than signing over land or a house. This was signing over their privacy. This was signing over their agency. For ultimately, the family and the estate could not be disentangled. And so in order to survive, they were signing over their home. They were signing over their legacy. They were signing over their future. They were signing over themselves. And so if you were a member of the post-war upper class, your estate meant nothing. That was not your wealth. You had no say. You derived no benefit from it. It was no longer yours. And now even your home was a showpiece. It was a prop used in the museum of the aristocracy. And if you wanted to live in your home, you were an exhibit. From the outside to so many, it still seemed like a lavish and wonderful lifestyle. They were opening up their doors to show how magnificent their lives were. But the actual life for one of these families was abysmal. You had absolutely no freedom. You had a set of responsibilities, and quite often tasks that you had to perform for the trust. What you had to do was show up, live in a very drafty, uncomfortable old home, perform when you were told, and play the role of someone that people imagined. No privacy, no agency, not really even your own life. You had become an entertainer, all while the financier lawyers and trustees were the only ones actually gaining anything from the estate. The financier class had won, not only taking everything away from the old landed aristocracy, but now making them dance. If you want to eat, you dance when you're told. For the financier class, this was a marvelous settlement. This allowed them to gain the wealth from these old estates, and this allowed them to gain a great deal of power over people who still held the legacy of names that once did have power. Yet they could remain entirely in the background, using these agencyless actors to go out and perform for them. And as well, to draw the attention of the public, so that if you were one of these very wealthy bankers, you could keep your name well away from the public and never have to appear for scrutiny. You had great financial power, you had great political power, and you had the most valuable commodity in the world that anyone with true wealth would pay anything for. You had anonymity, all while somebody else went on stage, sang and danced, and garnered all the opprobrium when the little people got upset. It was perfect. Recognizing this opportunity, many of these financial players decided that this was the best strategy. Jurisdictions would emerge abolishing rules against perpetuities. Financial haven jurisdictions like Delaware, South Dakota, and many of the Caribbean islands would advertise that they allowed dynastic trusts, and so much of the remaining wealth would move to these jurisdictions. Yet by this point, this included much more than the old landed aristocracy. By this point, even many of the industrial families had fallen into similar predicaments in an effort to safeguard familial wealth against reckless, irresponsible heirs. Many of these families would set up similar structures, landing them in comparable positions. And so now it wasn't just old dukes and earls who had become wrapped up in this mechanism, but people who had had very real, productive industrial wealth only a generation or two ago. These family fortunes would move into institutional custody, with the descendants becoming purely passive beneficiaries. For some, this situation was much better than it was for others. Instead of being bound to the land and the familial seat, although unable to truly control the wealth, many were able to get some agency off of the distributions which came from the trusts. So if you were the descendant of someone like a railroad tycoon, while you didn't actually have any control over the railroad wealth, perhaps you would get a quite comfortable dividend, perhaps even a quite nice house to live in, and you could have some agency over how you spent that. But this wasn't always the case. For a great many, the conditions were becoming just as strict. Many of these trusts had extremely rigid bylaws. Perhaps you could draw some cash flow, but quite often it would be tightly prescribed. And so to the outside you would appear very wealthy, but perhaps you wouldn't even be able to buy alcohol. There might be some rule where the trustees would take away your money if they became aware of you buying whiskey. Perhaps the rules told you exactly what car you were allowed to drive. Perhaps there were rules about which clothes you could and could not wear. This would vary greatly between estates, and so the amount of freedom would be very different depending on who it was. Yet by and large the trend was the same. If you were one of these very wealthy people with a high net worth, increasingly there was a very good chance that your wealth was actually a financial trust held somewhere like the Cayman Islands, controlled completely by a group of financiers and lawyers. You had no say over that wealth, and perhaps you didn't even have a say over your stipend. And so the situation was the same. For a great many people, they were actors representing a financial firm. And that's really the crux. For a great many of the wealthy, they are not wealthy, and they are most certainly not powerful. Yet, for many who look upon these estates, they see the astronomical net worth figures and assume, well, look at that number. It has to be great. They have to have some power. And yes, there is a great amount of power, but it's not the people the public see. In cases like this, the public-facing figures are really just actors. They show up at foundation events. They show up at political fundraisers. In some cases with the trust actually telling them who they are able to support politically, so they don't even have a say over what their political actions are. Perhaps they appear at company events, or maybe are a part of some sort of cultural heritage. Something like opening an orchestra on the first day of the season. To everyone involved, this looks like the powerful person, the guy with a great life. Yet that guy is really just showing up for his job. It's not much different than if you work at a large firm. You dress all nice, your office building looks new and fancy, and to the outside it seems like you're some powerful businessman. Yet you go to work every day and you know that you have no say. You know what you are told to do, and you know how to be a representative for the actually powerful firm. All while you really hate it. You really can't quit, because you do need some income. But it's not really a life. You're not really a person. You go where you're told when you're told. You play the part, and to so many people, they look at you and they think your life must be great, so you can't even get sympathy. You can't really connect with anyone. You're not really part of the upper ruling class. You are who is presented to the public to be what the public imagines the upper class to look like. And your life is pretty miserable. So what is actual wealth? Who are the actual upper class? Well, if you ask the honest common man, he would most likely say something like having a lot of money. Well, what happens when the family that you think are the upper class don't have a lot of money? And so you might think, well, owning a lot of assets must make you rich. Well, these people don't own very many assets. They actually have nothing. In the modern day, a great many of the families visible to the public as the upper class not only don't have money, but don't even have the assets. A financial firm does. They're simply paid distributions, almost like a salary, so long as they continue to perform before the public, doing as they're told, actors for the true financial powers who own the assets. And so this has created fiduciary paralysis. Very often, a family member may be able to be on the board of one of these trusts, perhaps even afforded the opportunity to pitch ideas to the trustees, but ultimately, the trustees, those financiers who represent the legal entity that owns the assets, have discretion over what happens. The decision is theirs, and so one might see a very wealthy family and think that they might be able to invest in some startup, perhaps. Maybe they could give a great donation. Yet if the trust does not say so, and the trustees do not approve it, it doesn't matter how theoretically wealthy that family is. They have no say. Additionally, for any family who maintains historic properties, artwork, or valuable collections that look to the outside as though they're priceless and incredible things to own, quite often any money that is actually made by the family or their trust really just goes back into maintaining those collections. And even for less expensive estates, quite often, a very large share of the money just goes to paying staff. So where's that money actually going? It's not the family. The family just share the name that the company that owns the assets does. They are required to go in front of foundations or endowments and give a speech, but they're really just on the payroll of the trust the same way as the lawyers, the accountants, or perhaps the people who are maintaining the art gallery. They're just employees of a financial firm. And so who are the true powers? The powers are the financiers. And especially for larger trusts as time goes on. Let's take, for example, a very wealthy industrial family from the 19th century. Over generations, these trusts go to build charitable foundations. They go to build institutions. And as the family continues to grow, all while these estates get a life of their own, really they become indistinguishable from any other financial firm. The family becomes irrelevant. So perhaps you might know someone with the name of some 19th century great industrialist. You might assume that person has an incredible lavish lifestyle and can do whatever they want. But there's a good chance that they're collecting a rather meager salary, following absurdly rigid constraints, living a life that isn't their own, while they're really just forced to be an employee of a financial firm, where they're toward the bottom of the barrel. Professional CEOs, investment officers, and attorneys, truly the ones who run the money. It's really very rare for a family fortune to remain a family's for any extended period of generations. Today, generally financial firms run this money. If you are a beneficiary of one of these trusts, the amount of restrictions that the bankers can place on you is really such an intrusion into one's life that many ask if it's actually worth it or if they should just forego the money and get a separate job. And that's a real question worth considering. Assuming a trust hasn't already been diluted so far that you're not getting that much anyway. Let's say you have the choice between making $60,000 a year, perhaps with someone else in your household pulling in some additional income, maybe $100,000 a year household income. Or you can pull $200,000 a year from a trust. However, your life is entirely constrained by a group of bankers. If you want to collect any of that money, the lifestyle you live, the positions that you are able to state publicly, the causes that you back, the place that you live, perhaps even the clothes that you wear, all of your life is constrained by these financiers. What would you really rather pick? And let's just say you choose to go for the money anyway. Well, going back to the fundamental question, would it really be fair to say that you are the powerful upper class? Or are you something else? Are you some kind of employee to a greater power, one that prefers to use you as an actor? And there are many different mechanisms that multi-generational wealth use for preservation. The trust structure with independent trustees is one of them. Yet very often there are trustees who work at a bank representing multiple trusts. Having a dedicated team of trustees for just your wealth is usually limited to the upper rungs of multi-generational wealth. Very often, trustees are representing multiple trusts, and they in turn work for a bank. Think of companies like JP Morgan, UBS, or perhaps Goldman Sachs. Yet the other model is the family office, and there are two main varieties that this comes in: the single family office and the multifamily office. And these are extremely powerful financial entities that by and large the public have no idea even exist. These are functionally investment companies who exist for the benefit of a given family, yet really act just like any other institutional investor. Depending on how they're set up, they could be more like a hedge fund, or perhaps more like a pension fund. Sometimes making investments directly, or in a more pension or endowment-like model, allocating to independent managers. And particularly in the case of multifamily offices, where a group of families share common managers, these are really just powerful financial firms. And in turn, the staff who are hired to run the office, investors, accountants, lawyers, white-collar professionals like that, can be really top professionals. And so after the generations that built the fortune are gone, usually you have descendants who really don't know all that much, and are entirely dependent on this staff. So that leaves them in that same place. This is a financial firm. A financial firm who makes investment decisions and runs money just like any other. There just happens to be a family attached to it, who are able to get paid functionally a salary, so long as they perform, say the right things, look the right way, and represent the financial entity, not even really themselves. And if you're from one of the working classes, particularly the inland working classes, you might wonder why so many of the upper class seem to all have the same opinions and back the same things. That very coastal elite attitude. Something that I will be exploring around later is that very often they don't actually believe this. Those coastal elite opinions are largely held by the coastal urban middle class. Yet so many of the 1% families, particularly the upper rungs wealthy enough to have a family office, are really told what they have to say, told what their opinions are going to be. Really, it's been the same mechanism since the 17th century. How financiers that the public don't even know exist become the truly wealthy and powerful, while the upper class presented to the public are little more than performers, puppets held up by chains, really representing the interests of the financiers, and not their own. And the sheer level of intrusion and control would absolutely stun the public. First of all, if you marry into one of these such families, there's a very large chance that you are going to sign a prenup. That's just off the bat. Yet it's become really quite common for these relationship contracts to intrude to every little intimate aspect of one's life. So imagine you're a young girl daydreaming about one day marrying a wealthy, handsome, charming man. The real Prince Charming story. That you'll get married and live this wonderful luxury lifestyle, doing as you please, eating the best food, and seeing the world. Well, you better get used to lawyers telling you what you can eat, what your opinions are, where you go and when you go, and, exactly how your sexual life is going to go. I hope you enjoy a lawyer watching you in the bedroom. These people don't get to even live as people. Maybe even more than puppets, they're animals, perhaps. It's like they live in a zoo. And that's why so many are so miserable but can't express it. Because how is the public going to see a net worth figure so large and possibly imagine that they're actually more dominated by the true ruling class than them? The true ruling powers of our world have an additional layer for the public to look at. Yet this layer are more slaves than the common man. Because if you have what is functionally a human shield, well, that's who you're going to be grabbing the hardest. And this level of intrusion and surveillance has gotten much worse in recent years, particularly for younger generations of these families. Because these trusts very often have kidnap and ransom insurance, the insurers have developed very rigid cybersecurity protocols. Thus, if they don't want to lose their kidnapping insurance, younger generations are generally banned from social media, sharing their locations, and speaking online. But that total lack of freedom to speak and interact online isn't even the worst part. In order to maintain that these protocols are being followed, they're being constantly monitored on a pretty horrific level. So just imagine someone like a 13, 14-year-old. Someone who wants to play games with friends online. Maybe a girl wants to share pictures of her and her friends having fun. Imagine even just wanting to join a group chat on an app, just to interact with your friends in the way that everyone does. Well, you're going to have lawyers checking everything you do. So imagine being that teenager. Imagine the empty suit from Steinberg, and Rothman saying, "Come on, hand it over. Let's read through all the porn." That isn't a life worth living. And so many of these people are deeply miserable. But there's no way to really express that. Not only is this an awful life to live, but it also feels deeply meaningless. There's a phenomenon that's been termed attribution stigma. If one inherits a legacy like this, it's very common to develop severe anxiety and depression, as one goes through life assuming that none of his accomplishments are actually his own. And so as you're so controlled, you actually don't really get that much wealth out of it. The alienation from the public makes it so much worse. There's just no way to communicate it. As we've explored when looking at financial institutions, the history of banks, businesses, and the true money mechanisms, the mechanisms of how money actually works are so different than what the public imagines, that you're not even able to really talk about the same thing. Well, it's the same for the wealth of individuals and families. Really, once you start cracking into the 1% and exponentially from there, it just doesn't look anything like what people think wealth is. And so there's no way for these people to ever communicate their problems. If anyone were to try to express how absolutely miserable this existence is, then someone poor, working class, or even middle class would just get angry and feel insulted. How can you complain when you have all those millions of dollars? But that lacks the fundamental understanding that they don't have millions of dollars. They are the tightly controlled property of a financial firm that has millions of dollars. And so many think that money buys you agency, and that's why people want money, to have agency. But if the cost of this on-paper money is having no agency, then what's the point of any of it? Who actually has more wealth in the way that people imagine? And this all keeps many of these people quite trapped. Outwardly, very often by contract, or if they want to get any of their payments, they have to keep up appearances. They have to make it look like their lifestyles are so lavish and wonderful. They have to play the role of the character that the trust and firm want. But in many of these cases, their lifestyles may not be all that different from the middle class. In reality, they might go back home to a pretty simple, normal middle class home. Eat pretty normal food, not go out for dinner, and drive a modest car. They might actually really not have a life that's all that different from the middle class. Except when it comes to how much they're controlled. Professionally, they're a puppet. And this is all very intentional. These trust laws are usually set up to be extremely opaque and hidden from public view, so the mechanisms at play are not visible to the wider public. But more than that, the true powers of the world, the raw financial might, held by some of the most powerful financial firms, and indeed some of the most powerful financiers and their families, do not like to be seen. Sure, you will sometimes get some families who go out into the public. You might get some like the Rothschilds or the Wallenbergs. But largely, why would you ever want the public to see you? You're not going to gain anything, but you're just going to get more scrutiny, and if things go wrong, anger. Really, if you see someone who seems so wealthy and powerful, like some sort of big businessman, and he's out on TV talking about what he's doing, he is far from the most powerful, at least in most cases. Because if you are truly secure in your wealth and power, you are not going to go on TV to try to sell yourself. You'll actually spend an enormous amount of money to keep your name out of the news. And that's what this financial power is doing here. They like having these families with names that the public know, these families who keep popping up on the wealthiest top net worth lists, these families who get their names on university buildings or have some big public donation from their charity. This is all great for them, because they take the slings and arrows and they have to face the crowd. But they get none of the real power, none of the real freedom, and as well none of the real wealth. They're puppets, and they're meat shields. And still, this is just too difficult for so many people to think, particularly people who have had trouble getting houses, trouble making their rent, trouble even buying food. The idea of empathizing with someone who appears so wealthy is just so alien and difficult to do. But what I'm proposing isn't that there aren't truly wealthy and powerful people. These people do exist. But when you see someone who is presented to you as the wealthy upper class with the lavish lifestyle, just pause a moment and look a little bit deeper. Because so often the people that you're shown, the people who often you are told to hate, are just actors. They're the ones being thrown out at the crowd, while real financial power scurries away. And just ask yourself, particularly in a time like this, where everyone intelligent enough to have actual power is well aware of the social instability and the resentments of the public, just ask if the people who are being put out in front of your face are really going to be the people with actual wealth and power. Why on earth would those people actually be put out in front of the public like that? They're not. And just to get at this fundamental frame shift, for a different type of example of who are you really being shown, when CNN and MSNBC, for night after night after night, were showing everyone Jeffrey Epstein, implying that he's some sort of super criminal mastermind who's running a gigantic trafficking network or something. Or maybe something to do with money, but don't look into that. How much did the other families of the Virgin Islands ever pop up? Ever hear about the Levies or Yulees? Did the TV ever show any of the actual slavery traffickers at all? No, because we know their names. We know who they are. That's actually a very easy thing to look up. Nope, didn't even come up once. Well, how about the money side? Ever hear the name Edmund Safra? Nah, who's that? Sure, he doesn't matter. Yeah, if true wealth and power were really being exposed, it will not be on CNN. Or like Elon Musk. Great businessman. Really cool space. I love space. Not the world's richest man. Not at all. The most valuable assets are not marked to market daily. Quite often, for the middle and lower classes, it just seems impossible to relate to the upper classes. It's not just a difference in lifestyle, but so often it just feels like a different society, like there's some insurmountable chasm. And perhaps one thing to explore is language. Very often the lower classes really don't understand the upper class at all. And yes, certainly there are elitists of the upper class who either fear, hate, or look down on the lower classes. That, of course, exists. But by and large, the ones who are really heaping scorn on the lower classes are the overeducated, precarious middle class, not the upper class. Imagine you're some rural working class guy, like someone from a hollowed-out Rust Belt town, or in the case of Britain, someone from the post-industrial North. If you at random were to meet someone from the top 1%, or a degree-holding, socially respectable, liberal upper middle classer, chances are that you would get along a lot better with the 1%er. Really, and I am ultimately just saying this from experience, but there is as well some data and reasons that explain why. The only truly horrific things that I've heard anyone say about the lower classes came from the middle class, not the upper. And partially it's because there's some resentment there, and to an extent fear. If you're in this upper middle class, someone with a college degree in a maybe useless field, you did as you're told, perhaps you live on the American East Coast, and you really fit into that coastal liberal mold. To an extent, you want to distance yourself from that class that there's a good chance your family was a part of not that long ago. There's a lot of serious insecurity in the middle class, and that insecurity has in turn made it very difficult for people to understand the 1%. And especially as there's an ascendant populist movement, and simultaneously this fear that artificial intelligence is going to take white-collar roles. That fear of losing that middle-class status is quite isolating. Just to explore language for a moment, and this is very relevant, there's a very interesting phenomenon where the middle class is a lot more careful with its language, and attempts to be a lot fancier, as if attempting to prove, I'm educated, I'm fancy. Just to take one example, I'm going to say the same sentence two different ways. Got it yesterday, they gave it to Sarah and me. Or, I received it yesterday, they gave it to Sarah and I. If that second one sounded right to you, then you probably have a very middle-class way of speaking. The middle class uniquely are perhaps a bit paranoid about I versus me, like saying between you and I, instead of between you and me, overthinking it. And quite often the upper class will be a lot more brief in how it says things. You might see a phenomenon like this in work emails in particular, the dropping of verbal cushions. Ask yourself which type of email you send, or perhaps what type of emails you get. I was wondering if it might be possible to potentially revisit the timeline, versus simply, we need to change the timeline. This certainly isn't universal like different dialects, but there is a quite notable tendency for confidence versus overthinking it, a linguistic manifestation of that precarious feeling that so many of the middle class have. And there's a quite curious horseshoeing that emerges as well, particularly pronounced in British English. For example, the upper class will say garage, the middle class, garage, while the British working class, garage. That need to make it sound more French and fancy. That's really unique to the middle, who feels it needs to demonstrate something. We see it in word choice as well. Say someone dies. The upper class is more likely to say he died. The lower class is quite likely to say he died, while the middle, he passed away. There's a certain avoiding direct confrontation of things that are difficult. And really getting back to the core, that's very much the case with talking about wealth. If you're willing to talk about wealth and its mechanisms, and you use terms like rich and poor, well, that's very common amongst the upper class, across the English-speaking world. That's also quite common with the lower classes. Sure, they might speak very differently. There are plenty of words that are quite unique to the upper class. There are all sorts of terms: family office, sent a millionaire, capital call, liquidity event, private bank, usufruct, dynastic trust, clawback provision, the use of cottage for a large home, referring to the island of Martha's Vineyard as the vineyard, or perhaps a term like the shore. In the South, knowing what a cotillion is, or the difference between having a nanny and having a governess or au pair. Yet meanwhile, there are many things that the lower and working classes might say that the 1%er would stare blankly at. Talking about WIC, SNAP, EBT, perhaps a title loan or a cash advance, taking something out on layaway, maybe clopening, or being on call, and knowing that something being garnished is not referring to a food. And though these are so different, they are both speaking directly about wealth and money, something that the middle class is very reluctant to do. There's a real discomfort about speaking directly about wealth, and particularly amongst older wealth and in older wealth regions, like the American East Coast or the English South. The upper classes very much know not to go around talking about how much money they have. They most certainly know not to brag about things. Yet they will have genuine and serious conversations, in the way that the lower class will as well. All while the middle class gets a little uncomfortable. They want to avoid it. And that's a big problem here. There's no real way to understand how the upper class actually works if one is fundamentally uneasy around it. Uneasy around even discussing it. So of course someone like this can't communicate it with most of the population. These are discussions that are really relegated to people who can understand. The middle class, for example, will use terms like wealthy or underprivileged. They're sort of euphemistic. About the rich and poor alike, we'll use the terms rich and poor. Here there's a bit of a parallel to the designer brand paradox, that the lower classes will buy designer goods with the designer logo prominent and visible, and to the lower classes this makes them appear rich. Yet to the upper class, they will see them and know that they are poor. Why? Because if you're confident in your wealth, you most definitely do not have a bucket hat with a Gucci logo made out of diamonds. There's actually another term for it that the YouTube algorithm's gonna be scanning for. This can make it quite difficult for many people to even see who the upper class is, particularly pronounced in New England, while the lower and middle classes might imagine the newest, most expensive designer clothes, or perhaps some expensive sports car. Generally, the actual upper class of this region have a tendency to be extremely reserved, wearing the same clothes for years and years and years, repairing nice old things instead of buying new all the time. Often houses will be tucked back into the woods, or perhaps down a gated road. A car something more like a black, blue, or gray BMW, Mercedes, or perhaps if someone is spending more, something like a Bentley, but not the lime green Ferrari. This ridiculous peacocking very much makes one stand out. There are so many examples of phenomena like this, and it's particularly prominent in England. Napkin versus serviette, lavatory versus toilet versus lavatory, pudding versus sweet, sofa versus settee versus couch, and it goes on like this. The use of functional versus commercial nouns. Do you check your phone or check your iPhone? Do you get takeout or takeaway in Britain? Or do you get Uber Eats? Or get Deliveroo? And perhaps one that people like poking fun at, have you ever summered anywhere? And where were you schooled? In many ways, this is language naturally growing apart, but in other ways, these were socially created. The use of double negatives, for example, entirely valid syntax in Middle English. The lower classes just continued to speak how English speakers always had. Yet in the 19th century, education for the upper classes forced children to adopt Latin syntax. Thus, I didn't do nothing. Following Latin syntax means you did something, yet in original English syntax only adds emphasis, as in I really didn't do anything. And while I move away from language analysis, it's a really useful platform for this larger phenomenon at play. The way in which wealth classes have walled themselves off, and the inability to communicate between them. What is something that is bourgeois? When you hear that word, what do you hear? Some hear bourgeois and associate it with fancy, nice, pleasant good things. A nice house, being well dressed, perhaps speaking eloquently, educated and cultured. Yet bourgeois to the upper class occupies a similar presence as Parvenu, like the designer good logo, tacky, trying to appear cultured but not, being indulgent and decadent, the narcissisms of the middle class. With Parvenu the social climber, the one who completely forgets about where he's from and tries way too hard to fit in with people who he's very new to. The upper classes certainly don't reject new wealth, but when you don't fit in it shows, and you won't simply be accepted because of the money you have. There are actual behaviors that you need to develop, and some of them just do come from childhood. Do you know which fork goes where? Do you know how to speak to the waiter? Do you know high-end restaurant or hotel etiquette? Which painting draws your eye in the gallery? Some of these things can't be faked. And are you spending the dinner talking about how expensive your shirt is? Or, oh boy, bullying the waiter to prove you're better than him? Well, you might walk away thinking that you made an impressive impression, but everyone else you just sat with is going home talking about how you're a poor boy dick. And that's the real mess we're in. The inability to understand each other. I took such a detour on words in particular, because words are how we convey our world to other people. And if we can't even fully convey our worlds across these different lives, then of course we don't understand each other. Like at the upper class rich kid college. The girl driving around in the new car that her dad bought her, talking about her expensive vacation, and then talking about how the stupid little people need them who know what's best for them. This to them feels so much like they're part of the elite. But what are the actually richer kids doing? Well, they're being quiet, thinking, wow, that's needlessly mean, why would you say that? And then going off to party, club, or restaurants without ever announcing it to other people, never wanting to say, haha, look what I can buy and you can't. Because that's something that's a whole lot more in middle-class psychology. And to a large part, that is what they imagine the upper class is like. And that's a real problem when trying to address something like this. Very often there's a lot of resentment that comes from the precarious middle class. They see people who nominally are the upper class and they imagine that they have those similar resentments. That if they look down on the lower and working classes like this, then how much must the 1% look down on them? But it's not like that. And this is a real problem, as there are very real, very powerful, and in some cases, very abusive and nefarious people out there. But with such a constant deluge of people being shoved on your screens, constantly with the message that these are the rich people you should hate, well, would the truly powerful people actually put them out there? Or perhaps, and after exploring these mechanisms, it's at least worth consideration. Perhaps there's a whole other class that people largely don't know about. A class who are just as abused by the systems and powers who really hold sway in the world. Perhaps the people you're being enticed to hate really aren't your enemy. And so I leave this as one example from many. The people we're told to hate. The people we're told to be paranoid about. For if you're some honest working class guy from the Rust Belt, and you see how the coastal elite have treated you, well, I can assure you that that upper middle class has spent their entire lives being told to be terrified of you. That you're some sort of unthinking, cruel, evil horde that are one day going to storm their homes and hurt them. In the wealthy middle class's school and in their media, they're told that the inland working classes are backward, evil, bigoted, mean-spirited, and heavily armed. That they just want to abuse people, and that one day they might rise up. If you've ever read The Time Machine, they're taught that you're the Murlocs. So what if all of these stories just aren't true? And if you're that middle class, who's told to aspire to be like the rich, but also told to hate them, all while being told that those lower classes are just waiting for their chance to hurt you, that they're evil, backward bigots who want to overthrow everything you care about, well, that's just untrue. So maybe these aren't the people that you expected to feel sympathy for. Maybe you still even don't. But it's worth taking a moment to consider just how many people are used by this apparatus, this system of financial power, to throw at each other and make fights of neighbors. Maybe so many of this upper class that the public see and become very paranoid about, imagining to be up to schemes, letting their worst fears drive what they imagine. Maybe many of these people are abused in a different way, abused by that same apparatus, while really, they just want the same things as you. Put out for the public to throw rocks at, all while the real power remains in the background and absconds with the true power and wealth. For in this hyper-financialized world, money does not work how people imagine it does. It's wrapped up in far more arcane systems. That's not to say there's some pyramid and at the top there's the real powerful secret families. But true financial power is extremely arcane. Perhaps no one really even knows who has what power, and that system is intentionally opaque. So just consider, when your ire and paranoia is directed somewhere, perhaps you're being misled. And maybe those in the gilded cage are being beaten worse than you can imagine.